So a warm welcome to those of you present and also those of you who will see this recording later on video. My name is Yatun Sastramidjaja. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and today I will chair this webinar in which my two colleagues, Julienne Weegels and Luisa González Valencia, and I will present our research project, which is called OTESTAS, Digital Authoritarianism and Protest in the Global South. Now, this project officially kicked off on the 1st of March and will run for about 9 months. And it's generously funded by the GDC program, Global Digital Cultures, which is a so-called research priority area at the University of Amsterdam. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank the GDC team for making our research possible. Now I will introduce my colleagues first. First of all, Julienne Weegels, who is an assistant professor of Latin American studies at the University of Amsterdam. And her research focuses on the politics and aesthetics of order and disorder, incarceration and hybrid forms of repression, in particular in Nicaragua, where terrible things are still happening today, we just heard. And in today's presentation, Julienne will address the sensorial qualities of online co-presence and witnessing and its ramifications for the meme-ification and memorialization of Nicaragua's protests. And then Luisa González, she is a filmmaker and film curator from Colombia, and currently she is a PhD candidate on Colombian popular cinemas with AFTES and CETLA, also at the University of Amsterdam. And Luisa today, she will present on her analysis of virtual videos that were produced or are being produced by and about the Colombian police in the context of the current Colombian protests. It's been all over the news, so Luisa will explain to us what it's all about. And finally, I will also present today briefly. My research focuses on youth activism and the ambivalent relationship, you could say, between digital technologies and democratization / authoritarianism, particularly in Indonesia, but also in broader context in Southeast Asia. And I will present a brief overview of some of my findings so far. I've been working on this topic actually since 2019, and initially I was also doing some field work on this topic in the region, until of course the pandemic broke out, which forced me to go fully digital ethnography style, which is fine actually. So I will present some of my findings there. But before we go into our respective case studies, let me briefly introduce our project. So Julienne, or no, wait, let me just share the screen, sorry. OTESTAS, Digital Authoritarianism and Protest in the Global South. So in our project, the three of us, we address the increasing digitization or digital mediation of both protest and policing that we see happening today across the Global South, right? And all these different happenings all over the Global South that we see happening, it reveals the what I just call the ambivalent relationship between digital technologies and this tense spectrum between democratization and authoritarianism in the Global South. And obviously, we're not the first to research this topic. And indeed, we do expect our research to corroborate many of the findings from other recent regional studies that indicate very significant parallels actually in digitally mediated protests and digital authoritarianism across different regions in the Global South. And yet we did note, and we still do, that very little cross-regional research is actually being done on these issues, much less a theorization of their concurrence, again, in the Global South. So addressing this gap, our research intends to offer a comparative analysis of these trends in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And specifically, we focus on the massive anti-government protests and hard-handed repression that took and continues to take place in Nicaragua, Colombia, Indonesia, Thailand, and recently also Myanmar. So I'll just go to the next slide, which gives a bit of an overview of the project. Now, in doing these case studies, we also take into account broader regional and inter-regional dynamics, as it is becoming clear that both digital protests methods and the instruments being used to repress them, they tend to feed into and spill over across borders, right? So through this cross-regional project, we emphasize, and this I think is a key point here, we emphasize the importance of comparing and connecting also South-South conditions, experiences, and expressions of digital authoritarianism and digital protest, given that most theorization on these topics, mostly is still based on conditions seen in the global North. Although current developments in the global South make all the more visible, we think, the urgency of these developments and the critical condition that it shows, including not just the complicity of big tech companies like Facebook, that has been a lot in the news here in the global North, but indeed, the complicity of much broader, powerful oligarchic interests, really, in forging new relations of power in the global South. And also its acute effects of these developments on not just the freedom of expression, which appears to be all that is at stake here in the West or in the global North, but the entire fabric really of civic space. So that is really at stake in these developments. Now, theoretically, our research is concerned with two mutually entangled processes. First is the consolidation of the new authoritarian term, as it is called. And this is particularly evident actually in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where multiple governments that are headed by democratically elected presidents, so these regimes appear to be democracies, they have nonetheless begun shrinking the civic space for not just activist dissent, but actually any kind of critical political expression, communication, and debate in the public sphere. And these regimes, they do so through an array of authoritarian instruments, including, all kinds of legal instruments, constitutional changes, repressive laws, and things like that. But also good old-fashioned deployment of militia, which is an old tactic, of course, pro-regime militia. And in addition to that, they also use more and more what has been termed authoritarian innovations. And these serve to consolidate their power in unprecedented ways, really. So to this type of authoritarian innovation, we may also include authoritarian uses of digital technologies, such as the manipulation of digital information flows, as well as various mechanisms of cyber surveillance and securitization of cyberspace as well. So in our project, we submit that digital authoritarianism, or the desire to thoroughly control, survey, and police also citizens' digital spaces and activities, that this is a key aspect of the new authoritarian term that we're trying to understand today. Now, that's the first concern. The second empirical and theoretical concern that we have in our research is the emergence and subsequent repression, of course, of mass protest movements that both challenge and are also significantly at the same time challenged by these authoritarian developments. So here we see that digitalization can also and continues to be a powerful instrument, as it was celebrated since the Arab Spring, so to speak, a powerful instrument for protest. And furthermore, in addition to that, we also posit that digitalization is actually contributing to fundamental shifts in the nature and the very organization of protest. Because what we see is that recent protest movements not only shift, their actions and protest repertoires more and more towards the digital realm, but they also appear to develop new forms, new types, new logics of mobilization and agitation, and new bases and orientations for identification, collective identification. So rather than a coherent group, we see that these new protest movement, these recent protest movement, they resemble more and more a collective assemblage, you could say, that expands horizontally rather than hierarchically through organizational structures. They do so in Rhizomatic fashion, you could say, across different collectives, across different identities, and across borders, both geographically and ideologically. So this is something that digitization has enabled, has facilitated in a sense. Innovation both for the authoritarian regimes and for the protest movements that challenge them. So our main question is really, how exactly then does digitalization, including the socio-technological affordances that are specific to the digital realm, how does this affect the nature of both authoritarianism and protest and inflect, its mechanisms and dynamics. So we address this question by examining both the politics and the aesthetics of both digital authoritarianism and protest. And concretely, this means that we are looking and tracing at basically digital spaces. Also, because of the pandemic, we still can't do fieldwork there. And for other reasons, travel is difficult. So through digital ethnography, cultural analysis, and all kinds of means that we have at our disposal, research methods, we trace how both activists and state actors produce, share, and reuse multiple types of multi-mediated political content on digital platforms, while we remain attentive to the slippages that can between the digital and material realms, and so as not to separate these two realms completely, but see how they actually are becoming part of the same reality. So in so doing, we focus on the performativity, you could say, of both authoritarian and oppositional power. And we do so because we believe that it is in this performativity, how it is expressed, how it is, how they respond to each other, in this case, in the digital realm, that we can discern these emergent developments as they evolve in their mutual entanglements. So our key objective in this project, just to conclude, is not only to analyze these country-specific cases, but also to synthesize, or at least that's what we aim to do, synthesize the theoretical insights gained from our respective case studies in order to produce critical, innovative theorization of the emerging global digital cultures of authoritarianism and protest in the global South. And for that purpose, we also welcome collaboration, of course, with colleagues across the world who are also working on similar topics in other regions in the global South. We will organize towards the end of this year a workshop, and we also intend to publish a special issue on this topic. So anyone who feels they have something to contribute or they want to join the conversation, please contact us. Just mentioning that before I forget. But now let's go into our cases, and I want to give the floor to Luisa. Luisa, are you ready? Go ahead, just say next.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, this presentation is about my ongoing research that is having an extended fieldwork phase due to the current situation Colombia is going through. So what I'm going to share today is some of the data that I've been collecting and my concerns about the situation in my country and in my city, which has been Cali, which has been the most affected by the state terrorism of Iván Duque. Initially, this research was based on the national strike that happened in 2019 at the end of it, and that lasted until March 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared in the country. That strike was a series of protests and social political actions scattered in the time, all against the current government. My research, also entitled The Way in which that social mobilization had to migrate to the social media, for example, producing a series of virals and memetics to confront the police and the president. That is what this talk was going to be about, but it changed due to all the amount of fresh and urgent information that I would like to share today. The inconformity with the government continued, and it exploded with a tax reform project that was going to make the middle class pay for the financial crisis the pandemic produced, together with a bad state budget managing and lots of corruption. On the 28th of April, people went massively to the streets, despite the country was crossing its third peak of the pandemic. The strike has continued since then, despite the tax reform was removed. People are fighting for the stop of other neoliberal policies and for social justice. Next slide, please. Besides massive marches on the streets, the strike creates points of resistance that stop the normal flow of the country. In the roads, they give priority to trucks with food grown by local peasants and not to trucks with imported food, for example. The points of resistance in the cities are also places for cultural and social acts, like sharing food in the ollas comunitarias, community pots, They transform power places into community places. For example, you see in one of the pictures, there is a police station that was transformed into a library. But also these points of resistance are the place where the strike confronts the brutality of the state armed actors. As you see in the last picture, there is the front line, that is the one that confronts the first attacks, but behind them is the whole community. Next one, please. Since the first day of the strike, the government has replied with repression, militarizing the cities and committing all kinds of abuses. The last report of Temblores NGO that has been keeping the number of cases of police brutality informs that more than 45 people have been murdered by the police. Activists and people say that it is more. There have been arbitrary detentions, torture, rape, sexual abuse, disappearing of people, among other crimes against protesters. Next one, please. If it wasn't for the social media, the strike wouldn't have been possible. It has been used to call and organize the protest, to inform and educate people about their rights and the strike's demands. Despite the censorship, like internet blackouts and the banning of posts and Instagram and Twitter, it has been a relevant tool to report the police brutality locally and to international and human rights actors. Next one, please. But the internet has also been a place where the government and its followers have spread fake news and misinformation about the strike that have produced an escalation of violence. With the same narrative they used during the war against the guerrillas, that of a leftist threat and the right to defend with arms, with war against it, ultra-right discourse in the social and mainstream media has found a way for acceptance of the human rights violations they have been committing since the 28th of April, like calling protesters hooligans, spreading false information about the strike being financed by guerrillas or leftist governments, and putting in front of life protection, market protection. Those are some of the uses they make of the social media and the mainstream media. Next one, please. This in a panorama of a highly armed population. In Colombia, there are more than 5 million illegal arms owned by civilians, which are more than the number of arms the state has, and a political power that promotes the creation of paramilitary groups since back the 1930s. This has made of the current protests a bloodbath. As a historical perspective of this, the current government, the president, the majority in the Congress, and the ministers are from the political party Centro Democrático, which has as main leader former President Álvaro Uribe. Since back in the 90s, Uribe created Convivir, which were armed groups of civilians or militias paid by landowners to protect their property from the guerrillas. When he was president in 2002 and 2009, these groups already transformed into paramilitary, work together with the army and the police, and are responsible, among others, for most of the massacres that occurred in those times. This particular criminal action was used to moralize communities and kill possible enemies. Next one, please. Most of the victims were in the countryside at that time, back then, and during the systemic murder of social leaders, land defenders, and ex-guerrillas, which has produced more than 900 victims after the signing of the peace agreement with FARC-EP guerrilla. These crimes passed almost completely unnoticed before, but now that the war against those possible enemies or government dissidents has moved to the cities, thousands of cameras observe, record, and inform about it on the social media. Next one, please. To exemplify the situation, let's see a new arm of the paramilitary that arose during the current strike. On early May appeared videos of supposedly members of the Minga, indigenous organization, committing vandalism acts and declaring an armed strike. Despite in the videos any face can be seen, either makers or witnesses are known, they produced a series of racist commentary in the social media and later on a protest against the Minga. During those days, also started to circulate audios of private chats where civilians in the city of Cali were organizing themselves as paramilitary group under the name of Good Civilians to lift up the strike by killing what they called hooligans. A few days after, the indigenous Minga suffered an armed attack where 11 of its members were injured, 3 of them severely. On that same day, high-class civilians were also protesting against them. The audios previously circulating on chats and which seemed like fake news and misinformation at that time became the premonition of an intended massacre. With images recorded by the high-class protesters, indigenous people, and others who were witnessing from their windows, Cesar Pachon, congressman, made a lawsuit where he reports how the police worked in collaboration with armed civilians to murder indigenous people. Next one, please. After that moment, more images and testimonies of people in vans shooting or kidnapping protesters appeared. On the 28th of May, the good civilians did a second strong attack, this time in the point of resistance where is Universidad del Valle, large public institution, and also where I did my bachelor. 13 people died and almost 100 were injured. Many videos and pictures done by alternative media venues and protesters showed not only the joint action of police and these armed civilians, but it made possible the recognition of faces such as that of Andrés Escobar, whose social media accounts became public and later had to make a public video where he explains he just wanted to defend his neighborhood. Next one. Well, to conclude, I would like to share some of my personal concerns as a researcher and as someone who experiences war in her country from the distance, from the diaspora. First, the amount of information I have exposed myself has been enormous, and that it has demanded a strong emotional process. When to continue, how to conclude, how to be emotionally safe are questions I make to myself constantly. Second, that I have realized that all those images and information have made a wound, that I have lived war through my phone and computer, and that it can be as strong as if I was there. Or even worse, because you construct an image where daily life escapes and takes relevance, those images of your city transformed in a war zone, the corpses, the background sound of a flying helicopter, in the voice message of a friend. And third, that when the research is already moving a lot of personal emotions, I wonder how to look the social media of those who support the armed attack as a means to stop the strike, for example. How to deal also with polarization when you don't have to look too far for it because it is already present in the family chats. So this is like this I close, and I thank you for your attention. I hope to listen some comments and ideas also to these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luisa. I think it's a very relevant point that you end with here. And I think all of us doing this kind of research will know what you talk about. My main solution to these kind of emotional stresses is basically to search always for beacons of hope. So this is also what I want to focus my my research on, my presentation on. So let me just briefly, because I also want to give plenty of time for Julienne, of course, give you an overview of the kind of topics that I've been studying in Southeast Asia, what I call here the multi-mediated ecology of hashtag-based activism and, digitally mediated authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia, where I work, which is my first fieldwork research site. So Indonesia actually has a very long tradition of student movements, like other countries in Southeast Asia. And their role is so much so celebrated that it's been enshrined actually in political mythology. But in the last 2 decades, the role of the student movement appeared to be exhausted. You know, there was because there was democratization, it was no longer necessary, etc. And also because the new generations, they moved more and more to the digital realm, to social media in particular, to you know, for their political expressions. And this earned them the label of being lazy generations, you know, politically apathetic. They can just play and do their clicktivism online without bothering to go on the streets. But as you see here, that all of that changed in Indonesia in September 2019, when a massive protest movement broke out against a set of controversial bills and legislation. Yeah, across the country, you know, people were pouring out on the streets, especially young people. And the kind of novelty that we see here is actually also visible in the banner by which they became known, and that is hashtag reformasi di corrupsi, or reform corrupted. So, and this reform corrupted refers to the student-led reform movement, of course, in 1998, that toppled then President Suharto and freed the way for democratization. Well, that whole process is now being reversed, they say, because of this new controversial policy by the current government. And what was so interesting about this movement is that it saw the first kind of spontaneous synthesis of street action and social media action that we've never seen in Indonesia before. And I say spontaneous in the sense that even the organizers, none of them you know, had expected such a massive turnout across the country. They didn't actually organize for that or mobilize, you know, for all these new participants that we saw pouring out on the streets. And that was also because this mass outpouring of online protests that preceded this street protests, especially among young citizens, apparently very easily spilled over into mass mobilization on the streets. And the result of this is what I call viral performativity of protests, in which this whole distinction between online and offline dissolves, or at least becomes completely irrelevant in the moment. You know, protest materials flowed back and forth between the digital and the urban realms. For instance, there was also a lot of graffiti in this movement, you know, that kind of was spray painted across the cities, which then circulated on social media and encouraged others to do similar acts. And there were also a lot of memes that were circulating online initially that were then, you know, transferred to protest signs on the street. So there was a constant kind of interplay between the digital and the material, the urban and the virtual. So, and interestingly, it was also at this interface between the virtual and material spaces of protest that a new kind of generational identity appeared to emerge. And that is illustrated in this meme that you see here at the bottom. It says, reject the contested law, the revision of the criminal code. And here you see power, really power, being generated by two collectives striking fists. The one is the serious, the group of serious students, referring to, you know, the traditional student activists, striking fists with the group of students who are who love to meme, so the meme-loving kind of generation. Now, this kind of combination really illustrated, you know, their very strong self-awareness also about, you know, a novel kind of movement being created here, very different from the old student movements of the past. And you saw that also happening in the dynamics of collective action. Very different from student protests of the past, we now saw the emergence of what I call a rhizomatic protest assemblage that was not tied to any organization or even a type of organization, but expanded across existing identities and even across borders. You know, here you see also the one image that was circulating online at that moment, where a youth, a schoolboy from Indonesia is striking hands with someone, a young protester from Hong Kong. Fulfill our demands, not one less. And this hour, this is very interesting because it doesn't refer to either one of these, you know, protesters. It refers to their collective struggle for change against authoritarianism, for democracy. So something new was emerging here. And this was evolving, you know, through 2019. But then, of course, there was regular repression. They were beaten off the streets. And then the pandemic also broke out. But the momentum was still not lost at that moment because, you know, once the pandemic broke out, everyone was bored at home. They just continued to protest online. And the issues then shifted to the omnibus, the very controversial omnibus law, which had all kinds of ramifications for labor rights, for environmental justice, etc. So there was a very strong resistance as an outflow of the reform corrupted movement. I mean, you see it here in the hashtag reject the omnibus law, and then here at the bottom, reform corrupted. You know, it was part of the same kind of struggle that they started in September 2019. And so everyone was very eager still to continue the protest. And if it's not possible, you know, on the streets anymore, then let's take it online. And what we saw then was a lot of, you know, throughout the pandemic, the first months, there was a lot of concerted Twitter actions like this call, a call for media action, a particular date, a particular time where everyone was asked to raise these 3 hashtags: reject the omnibus law, lock down the parliament, because of course the whole nation was in a lockdown. Well, let's just lock down the parliament and just stay at home, referring to just protest from home. And that was hugely successful. As you saw here, there were millions of tweets being disseminated by that hashtag. And as our social network analysis, which I did in a previous project, also shows, it was huge. There was a very strong presence of anti-omnibus law tweets in this period. This is from August 2020, actually. And there were also a lot of tweets actually that defended the omnibus law, most of them disseminated by pro-government agents. I will go into that in a bit. But at that time, still in August 2020, you know, the power balance was still clearly tilting towards the opposition. So this gave a lot of hope. And this is also why in October 2020, when the omnibus law was hastily ratified, you know, people very easily spilled out once again on the streets despite the pandemic. And even more than we saw with the reform corrupted protest, we saw here the impact of the kind of rhizomatic connections that were previously forged online between different groups. For instance, you know, when they were active mostly online, there was not just hashtag actions in which everyone joined, but there was also a lot of webinars, for instance, where different activist groups joined together and also attracted new audiences. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization of issues. And you saw that on the streets in October 2020, when labor organization, labor unions, farm organizations, environmentalist groups, academics, students, and religious groups, you know, all supported this anti-omnibus law movement. In addition to these groups, it was very clear that netizens also played a huge role in this movement. Here you see, you know, a social network analyst, also my colleague Ismail Fahmy. He had investigated, analyzed the social media traffic, and noted that, you know, the vast majority of anti-omnibus law hashtags was mobilized by K-poppers. So, you know, the young fans of Korean pop bands. So this became a new kind of identity. We already saw that in September 2019 with the Reform Corrupted protest, but especially now, the K-poppers really became a thing, a part of, you know, a driving part of the movement. And you saw that again back in the protest times, like, well, once K-poppers already, you know, take to the streets, it means that Indonesia is really messed up. Jung, and Jung is of course bro for in Korean. Another new type of audience that was tapped was via online games. So this is the game Among Us. I don't know how it works. I haven't played it yet, but apparently it's a very popular game. And this is also a new venue for propagating the kind of anti-omnibus law activist messages and, you know, having conversations on that while doing this game. So this was, for me at that moment, I had a very, you know, talk about emotional kind of connection. I had a very strong and hopeful kind of sense like, wow, this is revolutionary. Something is going to change here now that all these different groups, you know, form this assemblage and come together against this law, which was obviously, you know, very harmful to a lot of different sectors. But of course, then the regime responded. It had to respond, right, to such a massive movement. And it did so in a way that truly revealed this new authoritarian turn that we are trying to theorize here. First of all, there was just good old-fashioned legitimization via the mass media. So this is something classic, right? You see that with every protest movement, they are being delegitimized through mass media messages as anarchists, as irresponsible people, as people who just want to play, you know, their clown part as social justice warriors, which is actually a slur here. There was one particular incident where a bus stop was put on fire, and that was immediately blamed on the anarchist camp within the movement. So this circulated immediately en masse on social media. Like here, someone says, "I would fight for your cause. It's a worthy cause, but this is beyond outrageous. Now, you know, I take my hands off this so-called movement." And if it were only that, you know, I mean, delegitimization through the mass media is very common. But once people, you know, netizens, normal, ordinary netizens who did support the cause, start to adopt this message and, you know, add their own emotions into that through these emoticons. Wow, this is very saddening. Oh my God, you know, face palms. I can't believe that they're doing this. Then it has a very different kind of effect. I mean, mass media is something that you can ignore as a one-way, one-directional message, right? But when social media netizens also start to adopt and disseminate this message, then it has a very severe effect. And you saw that also very clearly in the kind of demoralization that almost instantly happened among this movement. Now, but it wasn't just the old-fashioned kind of mobilization of the mass media. What we also saw, because of the role of social media, is the mobilization of masses and masses of cyber troops, who were, you know, these mercenary kind of armies that can be employed for spreading certain messages online, whether trolling kind of messages or just propaganda. And there was a massive surge of this cyber troop activity, as you see in this next slide, where we see a social network analysis of pro-omnibus law tweets. And if you compare this particular social network analysis with the one we see here, then something striking, you know, a striking difference emerges. Here we see an organic kind of network of expressions, of online expressions, where different colors, different nodes, and they go in different directions. So there's different interactions going on here. But if we look at this one, it's much more organized. It's much more centered around very particular nodes who have very particular interactions with very particular other kind of, you know, points in the online realm. So what this is what we see here is cyber troop activity in the form of what in Indonesia is called buzzers. Buzzers are those that buzz certain propagandist messages, and these are usually based on fake accounts, or actually people who operate multiple fake accounts, can be 10, can be 100, and bot activities. So these bot activities especially are very neat and very concerted. So within 1 second, the same message appears, you know, spread across the internet, across Twitter by hundreds of bots operated by buzzers. On top of that, there were also, you know, real people, famous influencers who also spread that message. So as an effect, we saw an interesting graph happening here, where initially the anti-omnibus law camp, you know, there was a surge with more than 500K tweets on 6 October. So the narrative was basically the omnibus law is really bad, we have to reject it, and K-poppers are also standing behind that. But then within the time span of only 3 days, we saw that the narrative suddenly disappeared. It just went down. And the hashtags that were still dominating were all pro-omnibus law hashtags, like the omnibus law is is a blessing for us, and the omnibus law is, again, you know, will help us to fight corruption. Doesn't really make sense, but that became the dominant narrative. And it turned out, actually, from the beginning of this protest, that this wasn't just coincidental. You know, that didn't just happen because some people decided, okay, let's put out an opposition message in support of the government policy. There was a leaked document, a leaked telegram actually from the national police, that showed that this was a very, very deliberate kind of strategy that they have employed here. So the instruction that was given out to all police divisions was basically not just, you know, let's police and survey and control the protesters both online and on the streets, but let's, you know, let's put out a counter narrative that will defeat their narrative, the protesters' narrative. And this worked. So what we see here is not just cyber policing of activism, but cyber policing of the very narrative that that the activists put out there. And this is one of the first signs where we see a new hegemony, forming, or the kind of digital authoritarianism that we're talking about. There's also a cyber division of the police that purportedly serves to, warn people for fake news and all these kind of things. But but what they also do on their Twitter is, promote government propaganda, basically. So the ideology of the government, the policies of the government are defended by this national police division. Now, interestingly, and here I want to end with that, is the effect of this is not just a shrinking of civic space as has been theorized previously, but on the movement itself, it meant actually the re-emergence of, old identities, the old fractures, old fault lines, under, the pressure of this kind of multi-mediated repression. So what was forming as an assemblage was now falling apart again into all kinds of different groups and conflicts between them. There was only one identity, though, that kind of survived this onslaught of repression and surveillance and securitization as well. And that is this generational identity. And it really mattered that, just as the movement in Indonesia was being repressed and disappearing and falling apart, in Thailand, a new movement emerged against more or less the same issues. There were very different kind of topics, but there were the same issue of, authoritarianism. And then, of course, Myanmar broke out. And this meme in Indonesian Twitter was shared very widely. This is Angel, one of the iconic martyrs of the movement in Myanmar. And, all these kind of protest flashes emerging online and on the streets, mass protest flashes elsewhere in the region, it really, signified also for activists in Indonesia that the struggle is indeed continuing. And this goes well beyond what is often theorized as, diffusion, according to the diffusion theory, where there's mutual inspiration or borrowing of protest repertoires. Now, what I try to argue is that the actual socio-technological affordances of their digital mediation, in interaction with a kind of generational structure feeling that was emerging within these protest movements, it has this kind of viral effect where they feel that even if we are repressed now, the movement is not broken. So this idea of rhizomatic strength through alliances, not of solidarity only, but of affinity. So a sense of kinship that is emerging between these youth struggles. I want to end it here because at the moment it doesn't look good for neither of these movements. Of course, Myanmar is an absolute mess. In Thailand, the regime is regaining its authority. Indonesia is, let's not even go there. And so the new authoritarian turn appears to be very strong, but underneath, despite repression, there's a continuing kind of sense that we will go on. And I think the next topic that we'll discuss by Julienne will explain some of that, the fact that memories of protest survive. Right, Julienne? I will give the floor now to you.
Thank you, Yatun. Yes, I will indeed be talking about how protest is memorized, especially because in the case of Nicaragua, where in 2018, mass protests took place against the government, initially also due to a tax reform, so very similar to Colombia, and initially started by students protesting, very quickly led to murders taking place by the police of the protesters. And within what was a time span between the 18th of April and the 19th of July, so 3 months, reached a death toll of at least 328. So it has been the most violent political conflict taking place in Latin America to date, especially in such a short period, so many deaths. And the mass character of it, so very much related to that rhizomatic expression, really joining forces of what was suspected to be kind of a dormant generation, a dormant population who had become apathetic to what the president was looking to do. In the case of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, who's the president of Nicaragua, has been in power since 2007, but some of you might also remember him from the Sandinista revolution, which took place in 1979 and was able to stay until 1990. He constantly ran as an opposition candidate for the Sandinista party between 1990 and 2007, was finally able to return to power in 2007 and has not had the intention to leave since. And in that meantime, there has been a lot, so since 2007, there has been a lot going on in terms of the politicization of state institutions, the hybridization of security enforcement and all these kinds of things, which basically to the world saw the light in the way that the repression, in the way that the protests were repressed. So next slide, please. So during the protest itself, something that stood out to me was the tremendous importance of being present digitally. There were also, of course, quite directly attempts against this. So internet blackouts and the cutting off of electricity so that people couldn't charge their phones. But there was a very strong relation to being connected online, knowing where other people were, knowing where the police is, to the, also as Luisa mentioned, the emotional charge, the affective dimensions of being together and watching the protests together. Also because these were mass protests taking place across the country, you could, of course, not be present in every single space at the same time. So protesters were often also logging in to see what was going on in other cities, constantly connected with one another, and also connected with the exterior. So also sharing and live streaming what was going on. And especially in a landscape where a media landscape, which is dominated by traditional media that are owned by Ortega's family, there was a tremendous importance of the live streams as witnessing, as evidence that something was going wrong. And some of the media outlets decided to side with the protesters and started projecting filmed media that protesters had filmed on their news channels, because they also could not possibly have their news crews in multiple cities at the same time. So they used a lot and reused a lot of video cell phone footage. At the same time, there was this usage repeatedly of the streaming of the same kinds of events. So the same types of protests, the same types, so these mass protests with a lot of flags, with a lot of honking, with a lot of using the same kind of slogans in different cities. Also the tearing down of these chayopalos, which are the image to the left where you see this kind of weird structure falling down, which was something that was done everywhere across the country where these kinds of structures were there. That's something you could say, you can see one video of that, but it was something that was constantly repeated whenever there was a chayopalo being thrown down. It was a symbol of the regime that was being thrown down, and that had to be live streamed, that had to be repeated. And those were the small victories that through the live streams were constantly repeated and were very important for keeping the morale high. At the same time, what we could see is that the live streams also were used to document directly and vivo, as they say in Spanish, the use of state violence and para-state violence. So the troops that you see here down on the left-hand side are Sandinista paramilitaries who were mobilized to repress the protests. Next slide, please. So what we can see is that through the social media sphere, you get almost an instant meme-ification of events and people and symbols and these repetitive events. So there's almost the moment that something is shown on TV, or the moment that something is live streamed, and there's some kind of character that pops out, or some kind of slogan that pops out, it gets mediatized into in the social media scape. So this guy that you could see with the red t-shirt on his head, one of many barricade leaders, was almost instantly memified because of the way he frankly spoke on the television news. At the same time, in these posts, you can see the use of the national flag, the use of particular masks, the use of these homemade mortars, which are very common, of common use in Nicaraguan protests across generations, and the use of barricades. At the same time, as I mentioned, the repetitive events, but also symbolically charged days and moments, and how those become memorialized. So people, through the memes, you also memorialize particular people and events. And the 19th of April, which is the day in which the first student was shot dead, is of course memorialized as the day that the protest started, but also Mother's Day, which was a day where a massive march took place in which more than 500,000 people walked, where 11 more people were shot dead during Mother's Day, which was considered an outrage, or let's say the last straw for many people who did not expect even for a mafia person to kill somebody on Mother's Day. So these types of days are also picked up by in memorialization practices and by the diaspora. So the diaspora in the Nicaraguan case has quite a large role after the complete clampdown on the protests within Nicaragua. The diaspora basically took up the task of protesting for Nicaragua. So what happened is, after July, when Operation Cleanup finished, and in September, there was a full protest prohibition issued by the government. It was mostly the diaspora that took up the role of organizing protests around and using these symbols, and organizing them around these particularly strong events, and organizing them also, for instance, for the liberation of the political prisoners. One of the most important things there, again, is demonstrating that you are present. So it's not just about, hey, let's do something here in the Netherlands. So this picture down on the bottom is actually a performance that was organized here in the Netherlands. But is that pictures and the live stream of that performance are shared with Nicaragua, are shared and reshared by protest movements in Nicaragua, so that this, let's say, communal space of protest can continue to exist. If it's not possible in the material space, then to exist in the digital space. What we do see more and more is that these digital spaces are being impinged on by well, sort of like cyber troops that Yatun talked about, who keep on posting their own kind of government propaganda on the pages that usually the protest movements use. Next slide, please. So just to end off my part of the presentation, what I notice is that there's a particular significance of localities that also becomes reproduced in the digital space. Particular localities become these kind of symbolic epicenters for protests, but also for repression. In this case, I've taken out two. One is Monimbo, which is the indigenous neighborhood of Masaya, a city very close to the capital, where the protests were particularly strong. But it wasn't only that the protests were particularly strong, it's that they used barricades, and that they had used barricades in 1978 and 1979 in the insurrection against the previous dictatorship to help the Sandinistas, who are now the regime that they are fighting against. So there's also this historical connection with this particular locality, and that becomes infused with a lot of symbolic meaning and a lot of weight. The same similar kind of dynamic happens with the Chipote prison, which is a prison where political prisoners are often brought to, which used to be a torture center by the former dictatorship, again, the Somoza dictatorship, and is currently being used by the Sandinista regime to illegally detain, in many cases, political prisoners. So these become, let's say, these historical connections and these localities of protest and of repression become replicated online and attach value to them online. There are also, of course, in the case of Monimbo, when all of these barricades were up, they were highly visible in the digital space. But once the barricades are down, they become invisible. So there's no point in just putting up a photo of a street in random street in Monimbo. The barricade is the important part of it. And at the same time, there is no way of getting footage of Chipote out there. So then it's the testimonies of the people who have been there that circulate in the online space. And next slide, please. So to close off our talk for today, these three very exciting presentations and this project that is bringing up so many connections that we, I think beforehand, had no idea that there would be so many different things that connect our topics and that connect our interests. Clearly, we can see that the digital becomes politicized and that politics become digitized. We see this both, let's say, in the ways in which protest becomes digital, in the importance that the digital realm itself has for organization and information sharing among protesters, as a kind of alternative to the material space, but also as a space where the material space circulates digitally. So it's very important, for instance, when you're at a protest, to be taking selfies or to be making a live stream and to circulate that in the digital space. Otherwise, the protest didn't happen. So you also need the material in the digital. It can't, like we see in Nicaragua, it cannot survive on its own. You need some kind of repetition of particular acts, some kind of memory acts or acts conducted abroad to keep that alive. Because the digital space needs, let's say, food to keep alive. At the same time, you see this very strong rise of conflicting narratives, of polarization, of hashtags and counter hashtags and activism and reactivism. And in the case of both Luisa and my case, the appearance of not only state actors, but also para-state actors. And I guess also in the case of Yatun, I don't know if those buzzers also pick up arms, but at least, let's say, they are armed with government propaganda and sling that into the digital space. So there is this constant interrelation between the digital and the physical or the material. And we see this also particularly through the implementation of new cybercrime laws or cyber police in the case of Indonesia. In the case of Nicaragua, this very far-reaching cybercrime law that makes posting anything that's against the government an imprisonable offense. So you also see that the regimes constantly catch up with what is going on in the digital space. So I will leave it at that because it is 5 o'clock.
Thank you so much, Julienne. Yes, it is indeed 5 o'clock. So I don't know, but we do have a few questions in the chat, I think. Oh, no, we're not. Are there any comments or questions from the audience then?
Hi, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, Hannah.
I thank you all for the amazing presentations. I am also a researcher at UVA from Hong Kong, so I'm always constantly thinking of how, with the globalization of movements facilitated by the social media, what are the new possibilities of forming more concrete transnational actions, and also what are the challenges that are brought by authoritarian suppression. And to me, I find it a little bit hard to go beyond virtual solidarity, especially under the pandemic. For example, like the Milk Tea Alliance is always a sign that is circulated in our social media. But then how do we go beyond that and to develop more concrete activist initiatives between protesters or activists across different places? And also, as all of you are, I'm also a researcher experiencing these events from afar. And how do we foster transnational solidarity that can contribute back to the political movements in our home time?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important question, actually, and that's what it's all about in the end, right? Just like Julienne says, well, the virtual needs the material to feed itself. It also has to feed back into the real world, so to speak. Julienne or Luisa, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I also, from my experience in the diaspora and the diasporic movement to visibilize what is happening, it also happens that all these other realities that are happening in other countries, in other places, they come and they cross with what is happening in your country. So sometimes it becomes unavoidable, but it also enriches so much the process. For example, the other day we were having a meeting, and we were thinking, because when the Colombian news were fresh, what moved them, or what made them less visible in an international landscape, was the problem in Jerusalem and the Palestinian struggle. And then we were saying, like, but how can we find together? How can we create a struggle together? And we were reflecting, for example, about arms, about who gives, like, for example, arms is a shared problem we have. Like, we could research about these arms and have these in our protests abroad, for example. But yeah, that's something definitely to reflect and to keep working on more actively.
Mm-hmm. Julienne?
Yes, I think one of the key things, but also difficulties, is the topic of ideology, especially among people who are a little bit older. They tend to cling very much to ideology, and for younger protesters, that's much less important. In the case of Nicaragua, the ideological differences were very soon put aside toward a common goal, which was trying to get the president to step down. And the president formally is left-wing. His politics, one could say, are quite fascist. So there's this move beyond ideology very quickly from the street and very quickly among younger generations. But when that goes, let's say, in a longer term, so now it's already been 3 years, then it becomes politicized. Then you also get the necessity of traditional politics to put their stamp on it, and then it becomes very difficult. And then the forming of alliances across countries, in the case of Latin America, has been quite difficult. And in the diaspora and solidarity movement in Europe with Nicaragua, that's been a constant conversation. So this do we ally with people from Cuba and Venezuela and then go down that road? Or do we ally with people from Chile, which had their protests quite soon after Nicaragua, and ally and go down that road? Also with Colombia now. So what I notice is among, let's say, on my own social media, among my activist friends from Nicaragua, is that they are inclined to jump at anything that has to do with police brutality, and they don't really care what kind of regime it's coming from. And I think this step beyond traditional ideology is very important in contexts that have seen so much civil war, so much political conflict that has come from both political sides.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So existing kind of political fault lines and polarization within national contexts are really working against, forging solidarities with other countries. But this is indeed where we do need new political imaginations. And this is where, things that are being discussed and inspiring each other online does make a difference, in the sense that it helps, especially young people who are not caught in these, binary political binaries, to imagine new political configurations, new political futures, and also to sense the urgency of that. Because at the end of the day, we saw that in Indonesia. We saw people always ask me, so when will they ever be successful, this protest movement? Well, in the current configuration where there's very strong authoritarian pressure, with all kind of mechanisms and instruments at their disposal, and because it works, they will deploy it even more. It becomes almost impossible to do something within a national context. I mean, Hong Kong is a case in point. It's absolutely terrible. There was so much hope a few years ago, and now what's left of that. And but it still lives on, in memory practices online. As it is shared and remembered by other people, young people in different countries. Like, hey, the struggle that was started in Hong Kong, it is the struggle that we're having now, and that is a struggle that Myanmar is having now, and that the Philippines will be continuing tomorrow. So there's this constant sense of urgency that we have to continue this, otherwise, but how, and like I said, I mean, most of these younger people who are able to transcend these political fault lines and binaries, they're still very young and they are still developing. I mean, let's see what happens in 10 years when they have, different positions and perhaps a desire to forge new kinds of political parties, as we actually see in Indonesia also, where there's a new ecological party, environmentalist-based party. Ecological feminism becomes the driving force rather than being either left or right, conservative or progressive. So these kind of new political imaginations in which young people feed each other and inspire each other also, especially online, because that's your connection. That has to be a source of renewal.
I think us being here also in a very big international community, also in UvA, that like this kind of dialogues, I think can also go beyond the academic setting, the university setting. Like I do like totally see how perhaps I could invite activists from Hong Kong speaking in this conference also to share their experience, so as from Indonesia and Colombia. So I think all of that, like us being here would make a big difference in how we connect back with the activism and social movements back home.
That's a wonderful comment. So Hannah Poon, let's be in touch, because that's exactly the purpose of the workshop that we are envisioning for the end of our project. Maybe that helps. Ibnu, who is from Jakarta. Hi, Ibnu.
Hi. Thank you everyone for the presentation. So yeah, I would like to make a comment about Yatun's presentations in Indonesia, but I think it's relevant as well to other cases. I've read your previous research on the student activism in Indonesia back prior to Indonesian reform in 1998, when Indonesian students toppled the authoritarian regimes. And I think you've mentioned about how the playful elements has always been there in Indonesian student activism. And how do you see that the current use of social media change that kind of playful elements? I mean, do you see this as the continuation, or is it just something totally different from the previous playful elements? And then do you see that this kind of meme-ifications, the use of humors, would actually able to deliver the kind of resistance that previous generations of students done with the previous authoritarian regimes in Indonesia?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. No, humor is indeed extremely important to any protest movement because it's a weapon, right? Unfortunately, it's also a weapon that's being used, by the way, these days, because authoritarian regimes, they see the power of humor and mobilize it also for their purposes, to make their authoritarian messages more funny and easily to digest. But because there's such a strong tradition of playfulness and use of humor within the national tradition of protest in Indonesia, youth protest, this is something to build on, but it's also something that the current generation uses to distinguish itself from previous student movements. Like, hey, we have our own humor. like I said, like I showed, there was a lot of sexual references, for instance, in the humor that is circulating now in the protest science as well as online, which, but not sexist, but feminist kind of sexual references, like, hey, I control my body. You know, one of these signs that I don't need sex, the government is effing me right now, about self-control. So this is a different kind of humor in which they distinguish themselves ideologically from previous generations and open the way for, you know, new political imaginations, as I was mentioning just now. Julienne and Luisa, do you want to say something about, because I'm sure humor is also, I think we're too close off because we're way beyond time, but Luisa, a closing comment on humor, that would be nice.
Oh, closing comment on,
Thanks,
on humor. Well, there has been so much with humor, like like I have, for example, there's like this series of viral videos and remixes with the police, with the Colombian police, and it even has like an anthem, and there are like different songs mocking the police, and they became a way for people to create an horizontal relationship with these actors that have been beating them up, abusing them, and yeah, committing like all these horrible crimes. So people responded somehow with humor, but that was during the pandemic. It was the first strike and the pandemic. But now, in this current reality, that is even worse, those memes and remixes kind of stopped. That I will say.
That's interesting. So at some point it just, you know, it's not funny anymore. So
it's not funny anymore.
No,
they're not funny. They cannot be funny anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. I mean, if people die, then it's hard to memify that. Julienne.
Yeah, well, in Nicaragua, maybe there's a lot of Black humor, but it's despite people dying, there is a lot of satire and humor and memes, and so in the whole situation with police piling on people to beat them, there was a protester that was left alone and being beaten by a cop. Another protester runs up to him with a plastic chair, just beats the police officer with a chair. And that became like a running gag for weeks on social media. And the chair was like named the chair of vandals. So like the president of all vandals, because he hit the police with the chair. So they really directly use anything that pops up. Of course, there are also things that are just not funny, in the sense there was a song that the government put out that the president was going to stay, a song, and there were heavily armed paramilitaries and police officers dancing on that song, which is a very upbeat song, like na na na, we're going to stay, and it was a really nasty song, and that for people was just like, you have got to be kidding me that you're actually dancing on the dead. That was just not, so there are limits to this humor. But yeah, it's also very much used as indeed, as you say, Yatun, as a weapon also to keep the morale high, especially when you're getting so much on top of you, then you need somehow to make fun of the one who has the boot on your neck, as they would say in Nicaragua.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Each protest movement has a emotional dynamic, in addition to a mobilizational dynamic. I've been following the Myanmar protest on TikTok, which is designed for funny videos, right? So, and in the beginning there was a lot, because that was their weapon towards this old-fashioned regime. We're young, we're fresh, we're gay, we're going to do something crazy and fresh here. Like topple authoritarianism. There was a lot of fun, and it was, but then, at some point you only saw bodies, dead people, tortured people, horrible news. So that was a phase, but now the humor is coming back. Now that it's almost certain that they are not going to topple the regime, it's so, then it becomes maybe a sort of coping mechanism. I don't know. I need to think about that more. So it has different kind of dynamics and I wouldn't say functions, but different kind of ways for people to use it and mobilize it as one of their instruments. But also not just an instrument; it's a real affect, right? So yeah. So thank you for having us close with these comments. We're way beyond time, so I think we should close off. Thank you again, GDC, Global Digital Cultures, for the opportunity. Thank you to the people present here in this virtual room. This is to be continued. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day and evening wherever you are.